Thank you very much for the invitation. I was hoping that the introduction would be a bit longer so that I will have more downtime. But it's showtime. So my name is Christian, and as you can tell, I'm very nervous because it's a great pleasure to be here, and that comes with a responsibility as well. And so thank you to Parasite, to Anchi, to Cosmin, to the visible and invisible members of the team, and to all of you who are here, and to those who are hosting us now. I think it's clearly a historical moment for me to be here, and I also think that it might be the case for the city as well. So I hope that by being here, there's some kind of contribution that comes through just simply by being present. I hope so. And so what I propose is that in the face of such break, and in the face of the enormity of the forces that give shape to what I would call, following others, the history of the present, I can only but just really contribute with a small project. So it's just a drop in the ocean in the form of reflections from a project that I've been doing. And they're not answers or responses. They're simply reflections, if there's any distinction that can be made among those three things. So, a reflection on the history of the present through a project. And that project is École du soir, the evening school. And I will do so through the, recording of proximities in the form of what I call a modular playlist. So we'll see some images passing through, and then I think that you can best see whatever images that you're seeing on the screen as a postcard. I have reasons for that. And then there'll also be some fragments that emerges from sound and images. I try to include as many, details that describe what it is that we're looking at, and also to give quotations to those I'm borrowing from. So if there's anything missing, it's simply because I have missed it. It's not intentional. And of course, there would also be typos. And I should say that it's been actually hard to work on the presentation because I somehow managed to submit a doctoral thesis about a week ago. So it's been tough to concentrate again on footnotes, and but I tried. So if there's anything missing, we can meet at the bar and discuss it. École du soir, it's a project that I'm trying to think through, which is a term that I learned quite a while back from a number of friends who I will name in a moment, but it actually comes from the words of the Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembène, who is of course beyond renowned, but I'll try to introduce him anyway. And so he said at some point, somewhere in his 60s, I believe the first time was 68, that le cinéma est l'école du soir. So cinema is the evening school. So I've been interested in Sembène for a while, and even before I was haunted by this idea of what an evening school could be or what an evening is in the first place, I had made a film called Life After Life, which follows a man who dies and is accidentally buried in a wrong grave. So as a result, of course, he wakes up in the wrong heaven. So the film really charts the ways of living in these new unforeseen circumstances. So the film was made in Jerusalem in 2016, and you can imagine all kinds of pressures that in itself brings. But I'm mentioning it only because the story of a man who dies and then is buried in a wrong grave is an existing film called Guelewar by Ousmane Sembène from '93. So my film takes after Sembène. Sembène came to think about cinema because, first of all, he started off as a writer, among other things, and so he came to realize that somehow literature was insufficient for his own present at the time, whereby the reach and the scope of literature did not present enough, scope for engaging with the audiences and the questions that the audiences were facing at the time. So instead, he decided that he would switch. So he realized that actually cinema is more of an evening school. So he set off and started to work out what that would mean. That even included him going to a school, as we will see in a moment. So for him, film was a pedagogical medium, and of course we have to remember that all of this is some quite historical. It has a specific historical context. So it's not to say that I agree with him. I'm simply sketching what led him to formulate the pronouncement that cinema is an evening school. And so for him, it presented with new opportunities that other media did not have at that time. So to me, as I came to encounter the term, it's a paleonym for me. So it means something else than what it meant when it was used. So paleonym is an old name, which to me acts as a lever of intervention in the history of the present. And so I came to be haunted by it mostly because my supervisor, Kojo Eshun, had at the time returned in 2017 in May 2017 from Dakar, Senegal, where he had been invited by Ntone of Chimurenga to visit and to work there. And so one of the things they did was to engage and to visit the archives of Sembène, which at the time were located, I believe, just outside of Dakar. So in our regular conversations, we started talking about this name, and so it started a movement of thought in my own mind, which resulted in a number of activities that I have organized, some of which we're going to see in a moment. So I would say that in itself is already a dialogue that is between myself and Kojo, between Kojo and Tone, and then between Tone and the Otolith group and everyone involved, but also between everyone and Sembène. So now us here now. So another word about Sembène himself. He was born in 23 and he passed away in 2007. and he actually enjoyed an extremely prolific career as a writer. So at the moment, in fact, he's so celebrated that particularly books such as Le Bout de Bois de Dieu, which is translated as God's Bit of Wood. God's Bit of Wood is a fundamental text for in school books in a number of francophone countries, but I believe also outside on the African continent. One of the reasons why he was so popular when he was alive and today is because of his rather minute attention to, I guess, linguistic questions. So although he paid attention to what language meant, but he was mostly interested in how to simplify those the narrations that he would engage with. So, but he's so popular today that even now there's a film that was made a few years back, I believe in 2015, and I would just play a trailer to give you a sense.
Some say we are made of flesh and blood. I believe we are made of stories. So, let me tell you a story of the dog walker who taught himself how to make movies and invented a cinema for a new Africa. Who used his camera to fight corruption and injustice and imagine a better world. Let me tell you the story of the father of African cinema, who used his camera as a weapon and gave us our stories back. I will tell you the true story of Sembène. I will not let his story be forgotten.
Well. Obviously, I do not quite excuse me, align with this. One second. So I have issues with the tone of that trailer and the entire film, partially because, of course, to me, the person who made the film is the official biographer of Sembène, so I should tread very carefully here. But I think what the film seems to miss is to realize that somehow, to me, the film erects this monumental figure of the father of African cinema, which is a ridiculous thing to say, because you can't just have one single father figure of such a discipline. So I cringe a bit when I watch it, and the only reason I added it is so that I can badmouth about it right after it. So it's so you would tell that from the biography of Sembène, he had he worked. He's been like a soldier in the French army at the time in the Second World War. He was a driver and then a mason, and then he lugged around with a horse, and then he became a trade unionist, wrote some novels, and then only then he became a filmmaker. So it's really hard to to author a book about him or a film about him, and you can't just say, I will not let this story not be told, as though it hasn't been told yet. So what I want to say is that he had something I would also equally ridiculously call a poly-rational textuality. I don't even know where I got it from, but it's simply to say that the itinerant life gives it a texture that no single theoretical approach can pin down. So instead, I would say that, of course, it helps to fight against any possible monumentalization that would derive from such, of course, monumental work in itself. But the biography suggests that precisely he was trying to avoid this, I guess, singularization that generally comes with fame. So instead, he had an interest in the text, even in films. So of course you have to remember that he started as a writer and then became a filmmaker. But some scholars suggest that you cannot see the effort as completely separate from each other. So what happens is that even in cinema, in the films he made, a number of his characters start to read, which is something that I would call, I guess, some kind of desedimentary reading that generally proceeds through a number of other texts that, again, the specific writer who I'm drawing from, who's also actually wrote the thing as a PhD thesis, a guy called Peter Mwara Gachanja. He suggests that better ways of reading him necessarily must involve other disciplines. So you can fill in the blanks, really. Here he suggests Fanon and Freud, but I can imagine that there are better psychoanalysts, I don't know. And then post-colonial theory too, and then trauma theory. What I find fascinating, again, following others, is that in these texts or in these films, a number of these texts that, for example, in the film Tirailleurs, they start reading other texts that emerge in the wake or still at the time engaging with the question of liberation struggles. So that you would have someone like Nyerere, Kenyatta. There are a few figures missing, and that also goes to show that in a way there's not one singularity among them. So I'm moving further from the historical frame towards the contemporary moment and trying to work out what has been the legacy of École du Soir as a formulation. And more recently, there has been a new association that has been founded in 2018 called Sembène Ousmane Association, or Association Sembène Ousmane, which is located at the Sheikh Anta Diop in Dakar. And that same association has staged the first conference on Sembène that was titled Militant Artist. There have been a number of other conferences staged about Sembène at multiple locations in the world, but I'm simply just following that specific École du Soir. I myself have staged one event recently in Rwanda, and hopefully we'll get to see some images from it beyond the postcard that you can see there. So what concerns the literature, where you can find more about this if you have time, is there on the screen. And one particular text is very rich in resources, and that's by Curry Daly Moore, and it so happens that that's actually also his wife at the end, or his partner. And so I would like to summarize again as to why am I bothering with it, is that for him, again, cinema was the best type of an evening school because in the society of his present, because more than any other disciplines, essentially it beats the mosque, the church, and the political party. And that's quite a striking thing to say. So that he, for example, was contending that, so he's writing at the time when most films that existed or were screened on the continent were coming from America, India, and in Europe. In any case, very few films were produced locally, and that was a cause for frustration for him, because it meant that someone it meant an intensification of alienation in such a way that, again, these are his words, a girl in Dakar would want to look like Brigitte Bardot, which for him was a problem. And the fact that someone would want to, some fellow would want to associate more, or see himself more as Jean-Paul Belmondo, if you know him, than any other figure, simply because they were known at the time. I think a lot has happened ever since. I think it's perfectly fine to look like Brigitte Bardot, to want to feel like her. And so I'm not so sure if I agree with him. And it's simply to say that the fact that I'm tracing this term and intervening with it does not mean that I agree with all what is said about it. Which then brings me to my own interventions, which you could call them a scriptorium. A scriptorium is a term that is also very old, that you can tell that there's a term script in it, and it's a theological term, or more like architectural theological term, that denotes a space for writing in monasteries. So that's where books were made, or laws and other such things. But to me, it suggests a place where a variety of theories and practices can coincide and collide. And so far, I've managed to stage them in ways that bring together philosophers, theorists, geographers, botanists, a lot of interests that are not always shared. In fact, sometimes extremely antagonistic, but somehow manage to spend time in working out specific questions and tasks that we ourselves give, with the role, hopefully, of reinterpreting some of the terms that sometimes take hold of the question of how to live together in the history of the present again. And so this particular, at this moment as we speak, I happen to have to be honored with having an exhibition at a place called SculptureCenter in New York. And because the blurb promised that I was going to talk about it, here I am talking about it. And so it's made of hosting structures. And by that, I mean generally readily available material that is somewhat either architecturally or sculpturally conceived in such a way that it can host gatherings, meetings, discussions, or simply parties or so, or simply, moments of rest. And these materials tend to be You can call them, you can see them as, I guess, material fictions of some of the concerns that are written in the text or the images. So they tend to engage with the visuality of some of the context or spaces or practices from which the questions derive, which again I'll talk about in a moment. And the specific task that we ourselves have now is the translation of a book by a philosopher working in Rwanda today. And if you managed to read the very small font earlier, you would have seen that my thesis, I say it very hesitantly, but yes, my thesis stages a dialogue between Isaïe Nzeyimana and the late French literary critic Roland Barthes on the question of how to live together. So these works emerge from those few years of writing and staging these dialogues between the two, and in fact already translating quite a number of a significant part of the book itself. So what the group does is to gather and then annotate and discuss and figure out why this synonym above another, and generally that's reason enough for engaging with all kinds of other disciplines that in fact have nothing to do with what one can call philosophy or theory. So in other words, it's a way of practicing that is not necessarily divided between any of the disciplines, because I can hardly really call myself I don't know, a philosopher or so. But I happen to have the good company of colleagues such as Nana Dusepoku, Sharif Ali. Nana is a critic and theorist, maybe even a curator. Yes, she's a curator. And then Sharif Ali is a theater maker. Miren is a writer. Omar Berada is a writer and a translator, among other things. Everyone does many things. Emmanuel is a writer, Emmanuel Duma. Natasha Nzeyimana is an anthropologist. Christian Nyampeta, I don't know. Kaneza Shal is a theater maker. Serubiri Moses is also a curator. I'm mentioning these names also as a practice of invoking and bringing these voices here too, because that's also partially what convening is. And in fact, I would like to, I guess, stage what such convening can look like, away from the monumental that I guess that trailer did, and more into what such co-written scripts might produce, and not only in terms of writing, but also in terms of I guess, the material fictions thereof, because I'm not so really interested in a work of philosophy remaining philosophy, or a work of sculpture remaining sculpture, or food remaining food without being eaten, or a bed that is not really slept on. And so in all of those, there are, I guess, moments of, transitions or translations or transliteration, however you call it. But there's a moment of passage from one thing into the next thing that it actually already was. So in that regard, maybe we can pause and reflect and go back and forth, and with like a 2 minutes fragment of how such staging might look like in other forms.
pain to you that I wish I'd never been exposed to this pain?
So that was a film called Sometimes It Was Beautiful, and it's actually sometimes very hard to say that it's just me who made it, because obviously, you know, Winnie Mandela was there, Yasser Arafat was there, like a lot of people were there, supposedly, who all gathered and watched this film and discussed it. So I suppose that's what I would call, it's both a montage, which is a very old term, not old, but like an existing term, but it's also another form of proximity that together produce new, or might produce new meanings and understandings that would hardly happen if it wasn't the case. And so one of the strategies is to take the liberty, and take the movement, which is not really entirely freedom, but movement, to invite those who have already passed, and still ask them questions. What do you think of that film? If that's a question that is posed to a figure who made that film, but he's already buried, something tends to happen. And so that's partially what this film is doing, in order to reflect on the global conditions that marked the Great Lakes regions of East Africa, of which Rwanda is included. So from there, my colleague philosopher, reflecting equally, but then in the field of philosophy, he comes up with fascinating formulations, such as only those who have something in common can enter or can engage in conflict. It sounds obvious, but the moment you start to think about it, it also brings about new ways of thinking what the conflict is from within. So not always to be subjected or to engage only with the pressures that exist already and undeniably from the outside, but also to consider the interior ones. So one of the implications is that new types of relationships can emerge, that even among the most antagonistic forces, I guess such a thinking produces or can suggest what my colleague and now myself call a relation of inclusive disjunctions. And then again, this might have other repercussions that help to nudge a bit existing and in a way burdening formulations or questions, such as the other, written with a capital A. So these reflections again emerge from engaging with translations and other such activities understood as an evening school. So it means it can happen with the candlelight or in the morning, but always within the framing of what an evening can be. So one such moment also includes the convening of conferences, and one of which is indeed, I guess, to think in unit or unity, but also in contradictions all the time. And this happens again through modes of education, some of which are formal. So one such formal way, again thinking with my colleague Isaïe Nzeyimana, the philosopher, is a school that he has been running and I've been studying, that gives, it's already closed, but the programs included environmental studies, architecture, graphic design, from within specific histories that are always related to the pressing issues of the localities at the time in rural Rwanda. And so it's a thinking, again, that, as I was saying, does not stay only in the field of, say, theory, but actually the school itself is entirely built from scratch, meaning literally the bricks, you can tell where the bricks were taken from, what earth, and how long it took to fire them. And another project that emerges from this is it's another school called École doctorale, which places it's a doctoral program that places each student or candidate in 2 universities locally on the continent, but also outside thereof. I'm quite stunned that I managed to talk for so long, because I had hoped that in the spirit of, I guess, what I would call a chorus, so that, naming and bringing others, I would have played a clip, but a clip which I call, again, it's not really a film. It's more like a modular recording that can be rearranged, and in fact is still ongoing. But I'm sure another moment will emerge, and I think that's really the end of my talk today. I have 1 more minute, but I need to figure out how to spend it. Yeah, I think I consider myself, finished, and maybe I had already decided that for those who are able to make it to the workshop, we're gonna watch some of these clips and perhaps even an entirety of one film, just to calm down a bit, and then to stage the dialogues from another form or orality or so. I don't know, but for now I think thank you very much, and I'm sure I forgot everything I had to say, but I did manage to say a few things. I'm sure there's at least 1 good minute of footage that can go online. Everything else you can just delete. But thank you so much for your for the invitation and the presences. It's wonderful to be here and to think together. Thank you.